This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Allan Quatermain by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 20. The Battle of the Pass. It was on the third morning after this incident of the map that Sir Henry and I started. With the exception of a small guard, all the great host had moved on the night before, leaving the frowning city very silent and empty. Indeed, it was found impossible to leave any garrison, with the exception of a personal guard for Nyleptha, and about 1,000 men who from sickness or one cause or another were unable to proceed with the army. But as Milosis was practically impregnable, and as our enemy was in front of and not behind us, this did not so much matter. Good and Umslopogaas had gone on with the army, but Nyleptha accompanied Sir Henry and myself to the city gates, riding a magnificent white horse called Daylight, which was supposed to be the fleetest and most enduring animal in Zu-Vendis. Her face bore traces of recent weeping, but there were no tears in her eyes now. Indeed, she was bearing up bravely against what must have been a bitter trial to her. At the gate she reined in her horse and bade us farewell. On the previous day she had reviewed and addressed the officers of the great army, speaking to them such high, eloquent words, and expressing so complete a confidence in their valour and in their ultimate victory, that she quite carried their hearts away, and as she rode from rank to rank they cheered her till the ground shook. And now today the same mood seemed to be on her. "Fare thee well, Macumazahn," she said. "Remember, I trust to thy wits, which are as a needle to a spear handle compared to those of my people, to save us from Sorais. I know that thou wilt do thy duty." I bowed and explained to her my horror of fighting, and my fear lest I should lose my head, at which she laughed gently and turned to Curtis. "Fare thee well, my lord," she said. "Come back with victory and as a king, or on thy soldiers' spears." End note. Alluding to the Zu-Vendi custom of carrying dead officers on a framework of spears. Sir Henry said nothing, but turned his horse to go. Perhaps he had a bit of a lump in his throat. One gets over it afterwards, but these sort of partings are trying when one has only been married a week. "Here," added Nyleptha, "will I greet thee when ye return in triumph, and now, my lords, once more farewell." Then we rode on, but when we had gone 150 yards or so we turned and perceived her still sitting on her horse at the same spot, and looking out after us beneath her hand, and that was the last we saw of her. About a mile farther on, however, we heard galloping behind us, and looking round saw a mounted soldier coming towards us, leading Nyleptha's matchless steed, Daylight. "The Queen sends the white stallion as a farewell gift to her lord Incubu, and bids me tell my lord that he is the fleetest and most enduring horse in all the land," said the soldier, bending to his saddle bow before us. At first Sir Henry did not want to take the horse, saying that he was too good for such rough work, but I persuaded him to do so, thinking that Nyleptha would be hurt if he did not. Little did I guess at the time what service that noble horse would render in our sorest need. It is curious to look back and realize upon what trivial and apparently coincidental circumstances great events frequently turn as easily and naturally as a door on its hinges. Well, we took the horse, and a beauty he was. It was a perfect pleasure to see him move. And Curtis having sent back his greetings and thanks, we proceeded on our journey. By midday we overtook the rear guard of the great army of which Sir Henry then formally took over the command. It was a heavy responsibility, and it oppressed him very much, but the Queen's injunctions on the point were such as did not admit of being trifled with. He was beginning to find out that greatness has its responsibilities as well as its glories. Then we marched on without meeting any opposition, almost indeed without seeing anybody, for the populations of the towns and villages along our route had for the most part fled, fearing lest they should be caught between the two rival armies and ground to powder like grain between the upper and nether stones. On the evening of the fourth day, for the progress of so great a multitude was necessarily slow, we camped 2 miles this side of the neck or ridge I have spoken of, and our outposts brought us word that Sorais with all her power was rolling down upon us, and had pitched her camp that night 10 miles the farther side of the neck. Accordingly, before dawn, we sent forward 1,500 cavalry to seize the position. Scarcely had they occupied it, however, before they were attacked by about as many of Sorais' horsemen, and a very smart little cavalry fight ensued, with a loss to us of about 30 men killed. On the advance of our supports, however, Sorais' force drew off, carrying their dead and wounded with them. The main body of the army reached the neck about dinner time, and I must say that Nyleptha's judgment had not failed her. It was an admirable place to give battle in, especially to a superior force. The road ran down a mile or more through ground too broken to admit of the handling of any considerable force, till it reached the crest of a great green wave of land that rolled down a gentle slope to the banks of a little stream, and then rolled away again up a still gentler slope to the plain beyond, the distance from the crest of the land wave down to the stream being a little over half a mile, and from the stream up to the plain beyond a trifle less. The length of this wave of land at its highest point, which corresponded exactly with the width of the neck of the land between the wooded hills, was about 2 miles and a quarter, and it was protected on either side by dense, rocky, bush-clad ground that afforded a most valuable cover to the flanks of the army, and rendered it almost impossible for them to be turned. It was on the hither slope of this neck of land that Curtis encamped his army, in the same formation that he had, after consultation with the various generals, Good and myself, determined that they should occupy in the great pitched battle which now appeared to be imminent. Our force of 60,000 men was, roughly speaking, divided as follows. In the centre was a dense body of 20,000 foot soldiers, armed with spears, swords, and hippopotamus hide shields, breast and backplates. End note. The Zu-Vendi people do not use bows. Allan Quatermain. These formed the chest of the army, and were supported by 5,000 foot and 3,000 horse in reserve. On either side of this chest were stationed 7,000 horse, arranged in deep, majestic squadrons, and beyond and on either side, but slightly in front of them again, were two bodies, each numbering about 7,500 spearmen, forming the right and left wings of the army, and each supported by a contingent of some 1,500 cavalry. This makes in all 60,000 men. Curtis commanded in chief. I was in command of the 7,000 horse between the chest and right wing, which was commanded by Good, and the other battalions and squadrons were entrusted to Zu-Vendis generals. Scarcely had we taken up our positions before Sorais' vast army began to swarm on the opposite slope about a mile in front of us, till the whole place seemed alive with the multitude of her spear points, and the ground shook with the tramp of her battalions. It was evident that the spies had not exaggerated. We were outnumbered by at least a third. At first we expected that Sorais was going to attack us at once, as the clouds of cavalry which hung upon her flanks executed some threatening demonstrations. But she thought better of it, and there was no fight that day. As for the formation of her great forces, I cannot now describe it with accuracy, and it would only serve to bewilder if I did. But I may say generally that in its leading features it resembled our own, only her reserve was much greater. Opposite our right wing, and forming Sorais' left wing, was a great army of dark, wild-looking men, armed with sword and shield only, which I was informed was composed of Nasta's 25,000 savage hillsmen. "My word, Good," said I when I saw them, "you will catch it tomorrow when those gentlemen charge," whereat Good, not unnaturally, looked rather anxious. All day we watched and waited, but nothing happened, and at last night fell, and 1,000 watchfires twinkled brightly on the slopes, to wane and die one by one like the stars they resembled. As the hours wore on, the silence gradually gathered more deeply over the opposing hosts. It was a very wearying night, for in addition to the endless things that had to be attended to, there was our gnawing suspense to reckon with. The fray which tomorrow would witness would be so vast, and the slaughter so awful, that stout indeed must the heart have been that was not overwhelmed at the prospect. And when I thought of all that hung upon it, I own I felt ill, and it made me very sad to reflect that these mighty forces were gathered for destruction simply to gratify the jealous anger of a woman. This was the hidden power which was to send those dense masses of cavalry flashing like human thunderbolts across the plain, and to roll together the fierce battalions as clouds when hurricane meets hurricane. It was a dreadful thought, and set one wondering about the responsibilities of the great ones of the earth. Deep into the night we sat, with pale faces and heavy hearts, and took counsel, whilst the sentries tramped up and down, down and up, and the armed and plumed generals came and went, grim and shadow-like. And so the time wore away, till everything was ready for the coming slaughter, and I lay down and thought, and tried to get a little rest, but could not sleep for fear of the morrow, for who could say what the morrow would bring forth? Misery and death, this was certain. Beyond that we knew not, and I confess I was very much afraid. But as I realized then, it is useless to question that eternal Sphinx, the future. From day to day she reads aloud the riddles of the yesterday, of which the puzzled worldlings of all ages have not answered one, nor ever will, guess they never so wildly, or cry they never so loud. And so at length I gave up wondering, being forced humbly to leave the issue in the balancing hands of Providence and the morrow. And at last up came the red sun, and the huge camps awoke with a clash and a roar, and gathered themselves together for battle. It was a beautiful and awe-inspiring scene, and old Umslopogaas, leaning on his axe, contemplated it with grim delight. "Never have I seen the like, Macumazahn, never," he said. "The battles of my people are as the play of children to what this will be. Thinkest thou that they will fight it out?" "Ay," I answered sadly, "to the death. Content thyself, woodpecker, for once shalt thou peck thy fill." Time went on, and still there was no sign of an attack. A force of cavalry crossed the brook, indeed, and rode slowly along our front, evidently taking stock of our position and numbers. With this we did not attempt to interfere, as our decision was to stand strictly on the defensive and not to waste a single man. The men breakfasted and stood to their arms, and the hours wore on. About midday, when the men were eating their dinner, for we thought they would fight better on full stomachs, a shout of "Sorais! Sorais!" arose like thunder from the enemy's extreme right, and taking the glass I was able to clearly distinguish the Lady of the Night herself, surrounded by a glittering staff and riding slowly down the lines of her battalions. And as she went, that mighty thundering shout rolled along before her like the rolling of 10,000 chariots, or the roaring of the ocean when the gale turns suddenly and carries the noise of it to the listener's ears, till the earth shook and the air was full of the majesty of sound. Guessing that this was a prelude to the beginning of the battle, we remained still and made ready. We had not long to wait. Suddenly, like flame from a cannon's mouth, out shot two great tongue-like forces of cavalry, and came charging down the slope towards the little stream, slowly at first, but gathering speed as they came. Before they got to the stream, orders reached me from Sir Henry, who evidently feared that the shock of such a charge, if allowed to fall unbroken upon our infantry, would be too much for them, to send 5,000 sabres to meet the force opposite to me, at the moment when it began to mount the stiffest of the rise about 400 yards from our lines. This I did, remaining behind myself with the rest of my men. Off went the 5,000 horsemen, drawn up in a wedge-like form, and I must say that the general in command handled them very ably. Starting at a hand gallop, for the first 300 yards he rode straight at the tip of the tongue-shaped mass of cavalry which, numbering so far as I could judge about 8,000 sabres, was advancing to charge us. Then he suddenly swerved to the right and put on the pace, and I saw the great wedge curl round, and before the foe could check himself and turn to meet it, strike him about halfway down his length, with a crashing, rending sound like that of the breaking up of vast sheets of ice. In sank the great wedge into his heart, and as it cut its way hundreds of horsemen were thrown up on either side of it, just as the earth is thrown up by a ploughshare, or more like still, as the foaming water curls over beneath the bows of a rushing ship. In, yet in, vainly does the tongue twist its ends round in agony, like an injured snake, and strive to protect its centre. Still farther in, by heaven! Right through, and so, amid cheer after cheer from our watching thousands, back again upon the severed ends, beating them down, driving them as a gale drives spray, till at last, amidst the rushing of hundreds of riderless horses, the flashing of swords, and the victorious clamour of their pursuers, the great force crumples up like an empty glove. then turns and gallops pell-mell for safety back to its own lines. I do not think it reached them more than two-thirds as strong as when it went out 10 minutes before. The lines, which were now advancing to the attack, opened and swallowed them up, and my force returned, having only suffered a loss of about 500 men. Not much, I thought, considering the fierceness of the struggle. I could also see that the opposing bodies of cavalry on our left wing were drawing back, but how the fight went with them I do not quite know. It is as much as I can do to describe what took place immediately around me. By this time the dense masses of the enemy's left, composed almost entirely of Nasta's swordsmen, were across the little stream, and with alternate yells of "Nasta" and "Sorais," with dancing banners and gleaming swords, were swarming up towards us like ants. Again I received orders to try and check this movement, and also the main advance against the chest of our army, by means of cavalry charges, and this I did to the best of my ability by continually sending squadrons of about 1,000 sabres out against them. These squadrons did the enemy much damage, and it was a glorious sight to see them flash down the hillside and bury themselves like a living knife in the heart of the foe. But also we lost many men, for after the experience of a couple of these charges, which had drawn a sort of bloody St. Andrew's cross of dead and dying through the centre of Nasta's host, our foes no longer attempted to offer an unyielding front to their irresistible weight, but opened out to let the rush go through, throwing themselves on the ground and hamstringing hundreds of horses as they passed. And so, notwithstanding all that we could do, the enemy drew nearer, till at last he hurled himself upon Good's force of 7,500 regulars, who were drawn up to receive them in 3 strong squares. About the same time, too, an awful and heart-shaking roar told me that the main battle had closed in on the centre and extreme left. I raised myself in my stirrups and looked down to my left. So far as the eye could see there was a long dazzling shimmer of steel as the sun glanced upon falling sword and thrusting spear. To and fro swung the contending lines in that dread struggle, now giving way, now gaining a little, in the mad yet ordered confusion of attack and defence. But it was as much as I could do to keep count of what was happening to our own wing, and as for the moment the cavalry had fallen back under cover of Good's 3 squares, I had a fair view of this. Nasta's wild swordsmen were now breaking in red waves against the sullen rock-like squares. Time after time did they yell out their war cries, and hurl themselves furiously against the long triple ridges of spear points, only to be rolled back as billows are when they meet the cliff. And so for 4 long hours the battle raged, almost without a pause. And at the end of that time, if we had gained nothing, we had lost nothing. 2 attempts to turn our left flank by forcing a way through the woods by which it was protected had been defeated, and as yet Nasta's swordsmen had, notwithstanding their desperate efforts, entirely failed to break Good's 3 squares, though they had thinned their numbers by quite a third. As for the chest of the army, where Sir Henry was with his staff and Umslopogaas, it had suffered dreadfully, but it had held its own with honour, and the same may be said of our left battle. At last the attacks slackened, and Sorais' army drew back, having, I begin to think, had enough of it. On this point, however, I was soon undeceived, for splitting up her cavalry into comparatively small squadrons, she charged us furiously with them, all along the line, and then once more sullenly rolled her tens of thousands of sword and spearmen down upon our weakened squares and squadrons, Sorais herself directing the movement, as fearless as a lioness heading the main attack. On they came like an avalanche. I saw her golden helm gleaming in the van, our counter charges of cavalry entirely failing to check their forward sweep. Now they had struck us, and our centre bent in like a bow beneath the weight of their rush. It parted, and had not the 10,000 men in reserve charged down to its support, it must have been utterly destroyed. As for Good's three squares, they were swept backwards like boats upon an incoming tide, and the foremost one was burst into and lost half its remaining men. But the effort was too fierce and terrible to last. Suddenly the battle came, as it were, to a turning point, and for a minute or two stood still. Then it began to move toward Sorais' camp. Just then, too, Nasta's fierce and almost invincible Highlanders, either because they were disheartened by their losses or by way of a ruse, fell back, and the remains of Good's gallant squares, leaving the positions they had held for so many hours, cheered wildly and rashly followed them down the slope, whereon the swarms of swordsmen turned to envelop them, and once more flung themselves upon them with a yell. Taken thus on every side, what remained of the first square was quickly destroyed, and I perceived that the second, in which I could see Good himself mounted on a large horse, was on the point of annihilation. A few more minutes and it was broken, its streaming colours sank, and I lost sight of Good in the confused and hideous slaughter that ensued. Presently, however, a cream-coloured horse with a snow-white mane and tail burst from the ruins of the square and came rushing past me riderless and with wide streaming reins, and in it I recognized the charger that Good had been riding. Then I hesitated no longer, but taking with me half my effective cavalry force, which now amounted to between 4,000 and 5,000 men, I commended myself to God, and without waiting for orders, I charged straight down upon Nasta's swordsmen. Seeing me coming, and being warned by the thunder of my horse's hoofs, the majority of them faced round, and gave us a right warm welcome. Not an inch would they yield. In vain did we hack and trample them down as we ploughed a broad red furrow through their thousands. They seemed to re-arise by hundreds, driving their terrible sharp swords into our horses or severing their hamstrings, and then hacking the troopers who came to the ground with them almost into pieces. My horse was speedily killed under me, but luckily I had a fresh one, my own favourite, a coal-black mare Nyleptha had given me, being held in reserve behind, and on this I afterwards mounted. Meanwhile I had to get along as best I could, for I was pretty well lost sight of by my men in the mad confusion of the moment. My voice, of course, could not be heard in the midst of the clanging of steel and the shrieks of rage and agony. Presently I found myself mixed up with the remnants of the square, which had formed round its leader, Good, and was fighting desperately for existence. I stumbled against somebody, and glancing down, caught sight of Good's eyeglass. He had been beaten to his knee. Over him was a great fellow swinging a heavy sword. Somehow I managed to run the man through with the sime I had taken from the Masai, whose hand I had cut off. But as I did so he dealt me a frightful blow on the left side and breast with the sword, and though my chain shirt saved my life, I felt that I was badly hurt. For a minute I fell on to my hands and knees among the dead and dying, and turned sick and faint. When I came to again, I saw that Nasta's spearmen, or rather those of them who remained, were retreating back across the stream, and that Good was there by me, smiling sweetly. "Near go that," he shouted, "but all's well that ends well." I assented, but I could not help feeling that it had not ended well for me. I was sorely hurt. Just then we saw the smaller bodies of cavalry stationed on our extreme right and left, and which were now reinforced by the 3,000 sabres which we had held in reserve, flash out like arrows from their posts and fall upon the disordered flanks of Sorais' forces, and that charge decided the issue of the battle. In another minute or two the enemy was in slow and sullen retreat across the little stream, where they once more reformed. Then came another lull, during which I managed to get a second horse, and received my orders to advance from Sir Henry, and then with one fierce deep-throated roar, with a waving of banners and a wide flashing of steel, the remains of our army took the offensive and began to sweep down, slowly indeed, but irresistibly, from the positions they had so gallantly held all day. At last it was our turn to attack. On we moved, over the piled-up masses of dead and dying, and were approaching the stream, when suddenly I perceived an extraordinary sight. Galloping wildly towards us, his arms tightly clasped around his horse's neck, against which his blanched cheek was tightly pressed, was a man arrayed in the full costume of a Zu-Vendi general, but in whom, as he came nearer, I recognized none other than our lost Alphonse. It was impossible even then to mistake those curling mustachios. In a minute he was tearing through our ranks and narrowly escaped being cut down, till at last somebody caught his horse's bridle, and he was brought to me just as a momentary halt occurred in our advance to allow what remained of our shattered squares to form into line. "Ah, monsieur," he gasped out in a voice that was nearly inarticulate with fright, "grace to the sky, it is you! Ah, what I have endured! But you win, monsieur, you win! They fly, the lâche! But listen, monsieur, I forget, it is no good. The Queen is to be murdered tomorrow at the first light in the palace of Milosis. Her guards will leave their posts and the priests are going to kill her. Ah, yes, they little thought it, but I was ensconced beneath a banner, and I heard it all." "What?" I said, horror-struck. "What do you mean?" "What I say, monsieur. That devil of a Nasta, he went last night to settle the affair with the Archbishop (Agon). The guard will leave open the little gate leading from the great stair and go away, and Nasta and Agon's priests will come in and kill her. Themselves they would not kill her." "Come with me," I said, and shouting to the staff officer next to me to take over the command, I snatched his bridle and galloped as hard as I could for the spot, between a quarter and half a mile off, where I saw the royal pennon flying, and where I knew that I should find Curtis if he were still alive. On we tore, our horses clearing heaps of dead and dying men, and splashing through pools of blood, on past the long broken lines of spearmen to where, mounted on the white stallion Nyleptha had sent to him as a parting gift, I saw Sir Henry's form towering above the generals who surrounded him. Just as we reached him the advance began again. A bloody cloth was bound around his head, but I saw that his eye was as bright and keen as ever. Beside him was old Umslopogaas, his axe red with blood, but looking quite fresh and uninjured. "What's wrong, Quatermain?" he shouted. "Everything. There is a plot to murder the Queen tomorrow at dawn. Alphonse here, who has just escaped from Sorais, has overheard it all," and I rapidly repeated to him what the Frenchman had told me. Curtis's face turned deadly pale and his jaw dropped. "At dawn!" he gasped, "and it is now sunset. It dawns before 4, and we are nearly 100 miles off. 9 hours at the outside. What is to be done?" An idea entered into my head. "Is that horse of yours fresh?" I said. "Yes, I have only just got on to him when my last was killed, and he has been fed." "So was mine. Get off him, and let Umslopogaas mount. He can ride well. We will be at Milosis before dawn, or if we are not, well, we cannot help it. No, no, it is impossible for you to leave now. You would be seen, and it would turn the fate of the battle. It is not half won yet. The soldiers would think you were making a bolt of it. Quick now." In a moment he was down, and at my bidding Umslopogaas sprang into the empty saddle. "Now farewell," I said. "Send 1,000 horsemen with remounts after us in an hour if possible. Stay, dispatch a general to the left wing to take over the command and explain my absence." "You will do your best to save her, Quatermain," he said in a broken voice. "Ay, that I will. Go on, you are being left behind." He cast one glance at us, and accompanied by his staff galloped off to join the advance, which by this time was fording the little brook that now ran red with the blood of the fallen. As for Umslopogaas and myself, we left that dreadful field as arrows leave a bow, and in a few minutes had passed right out of the sight of slaughter, the smell of blood, and the turmoil and shouting, which only came to our ears as a faint, far-off roaring like the sound of distant breakers. End of chapter 20.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Allan Quatermain by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 21. Away, away. At the top of the rise, we halted for a second to breathe our horses, and turning, glanced at the battle beneath us, which, illumined as it was by the fierce rays of the sinking sun, staining the whole scene red, looked from where we were more like some wild titanic picture than an actual hand-to-hand combat. The distinguishing scenic effect from that distance was the countless distinct flashes of light reflected from the swords and spears. Otherwise, the panorama was not so grand as might have been expected. The great green lap of sward in which the struggle was being fought out, the bold round outline of the hills behind, and the wide sweep of the plain beyond seemed to dwarf it, and what was tremendous enough when one was in it grew insignificant when viewed from the distance. But is it not thus with all the affairs and doings of our race, about which we blow the loud trumpet and make such a fuss and worry? How utterly ant-like and morally and physically insignificant must they seem to the calm eyes that watch them from the arching depths above. "We win the day, Macumazahn," said old Umslopogaas, taking in the whole situation with a glance of his practised eye. "Look, the Lady of the Night's forces give on every side. There is no stiffness left in them. They bend like hot iron. They are fighting with but half a heart. But, alas, the battle will in a manner be drawn, for the darkness gathers, and the regiments will not be able to follow and slay." And he shook his head sadly. "But," he added, "I do not think that they will fight again. We have fed them with too strong a meat. Ah, it is well to have lived. At last I have seen a fight worth seeing." By this time we were on our way again, and as we went side by side I told him what our mission was, and how that, if it failed, all the lives that had been lost that day would have been lost in vain. "Ah," he said, "nigh on 100 miles, and no horses but these, and to be there before the dawn. Well, away, away! Man can but try, Macumazahn, and mayhap we shall be there in time to split that old witch-finder's (Agon's) skull for him. Once he wanted to burn us, the old rain-maker, did he? And now he would set a snare for my mother, Nyleptha, would he? Good! So sure as my name is the name of the woodpecker, so surely be my mother alive or dead will I split him to the beard. Ay, by T'Chaka's head I swear it." And he shook Inkosi-kaas as he galloped. By now the darkness was closing in, but fortunately there would be a moon later, and the road was good. On we sped through the twilight. The two splendid horses we bestrode had got their wind by this, and were sweeping along with a wide, steady stride that neither failed nor varied for mile upon mile. Down the side of slopes we galloped, across wide vales that stretched to the foot of far-off hills. Nearer and nearer grew the blue hills. Now we were travelling up their steeps, and now we were over and passing towards others that sprang up like visions in the far, faint distance beyond. On, never pausing or drawing rein, through the perfect quiet of the night, that was set like a song to the falling music of our horses' hoofs. On, past deserted villages, where only some forgotten starving dog howled a melancholy welcome. On, past lonely moated dwellings. On, through the white patchy moonlight that lay coldly upon the wide bosom of the earth, as though there was no warmth in it. On, knee to knee, for hour after hour. We spake not, but bent us forward on the necks of those two glorious horses, and listened to their deep, long-drawn breaths as they filled their great lungs, and to the regular unfaltering ring of their round hoofs. Grim and black indeed did old Umslopogaas look beside me, mounted upon the great white horse, like death in the Revelation of St. John, as now and again, lifting his fierce set face, he gazed out along the road, and pointed with his axe towards some distant rise or house. And so on, still on, without break or pause for hour after hour. At last I felt that even the splendid animal that I rode was beginning to give out. I looked at my watch. It was nearly midnight, and we were considerably more than halfway. On the top of a rise was a little spring which I remembered because I had slept by it a few nights before, and here I motioned to Umslopogaas to pull up, having determined to give the horses and ourselves 10 minutes to breathe in. He did so, and we dismounted, that is to say, Umslopogaas did, and then helped me off, for what with fatigue, stiffness, and the pain of my wound, I could not do so for myself. And then the gallant horses stood panting there, resting first one leg and then another, while the sweat fell drip, drip from them, and the steam rose and hung in pale clouds in the still night air. Leaving Umslopogaas to hold the horses, I hobbled to the spring and drank deep of its sweet waters. I had had nothing but a single mouthful of wine since midday, when the battle began, and I was parched up, though my fatigue was too great to allow me to feel hungry. Then, having laved my fevered head and hands, I returned, and the Zulu went and drank. Next we allowed the horses to take a couple of mouthfuls each, no more. And oh, what a struggle we had to get the poor beasts away from the water. There were yet 2 minutes, and I employed it in hobbling up and down to try and relieve my stiffness, and in inspecting the condition of the horses. My mare, gallant animal though she was evidently much distressed. She hung her head, and her eyes looked sick and dull. But Daylight, Nyleptha's glorious horse, who, if he is served aright, should, like the steeds who saved great Rameses in his need, feed for the rest of his days out of a golden manger, was still, comparatively speaking, fresh, notwithstanding the fact that he had had by far the heavier weight to carry. He was tucked up, indeed, and his legs were weary, but his eye was bright and clear, and he held his shapely head up and gazed out into the darkness round him in a way that seemed to say that whoever failed, he was good for those 45 miles that yet lay between us and Milosis. Then Umslopogaas helped me into the saddle, and, vigorous old savage that he was, vaulted into his own without touching a stirrup, and we were off once more, slowly at first, till the horses got into their stride, and then more swiftly. So we passed over another 10 miles, and then came a long weary rise of some 6 or 7 miles, and 3 times did my poor black mare nearly come to the ground with me. But on the top she seemed to gather herself together, and rattled down the slope with long convulsive strides, breathing in gasps. We did that 3 or 4 miles more swiftly than any since we had started on our wild ride, but I felt it to be a last effort, and I was right. Suddenly my poor horse took the bit between her teeth, and bolted furiously along a stretch of level ground for some 300 or 400 yards, and then, with 2 or 3 jerky strides, pulled herself up and fell with a crash right on to her head, I rolling myself free as she did so. As I struggled to my feet, the brave beast raised her head and looked at me with piteous bloodshot eyes, and then her head dropped with a groan, and she was dead. Her heart was broken. Umslopogaas pulled up beside the carcass, and I looked at him in dismay. There were still more than 20 miles to do by dawn, and how were we to do it with one horse? It seemed hopeless, but I had forgotten the old Zulu's extraordinary running powers. Without a single word he sprang from the saddle and began to hoist me into it. "What wilt thou do?" I asked. "Run," he answered, seizing my stirrup leather. Then off we went again, almost as fast as before, and oh, the relief it was to me to get that change of horses. Anybody who has ever ridden against time will know what it meant. Daylight sped along at a long stretching hand gallop, giving the gaunt Zulu a lift at every stride. It was a wonderful thing to see old Umslopogaas run mile after mile, his lips slightly parted and his nostrils agape like the horse's. Every 5 miles or so we stopped for a few minutes to let him get his breath, and then flew on again. "Canst thou go farther?" I said at the third of these stoppages, "or shall I leave thee to follow me?" He pointed with his axe to a dim mass before us. It was the Temple of the Sun, now not more than 5 miles away. "I reach it or I die," he gasped. Oh, that last 5 miles! The skin was rubbed from the inside of my legs, and every movement of my horse gave me anguish. Nor was that all. I was exhausted with toil, want of food and sleep, and also suffering very much from the blow I had received on my left side. It seemed as though a piece of bone or something was slowly piercing into my lung. Poor Daylight, too, was pretty nearly finished, and no wonder. But there was a smell of dawn in the air, and we might not stay. Better that all three of us should die upon the road than that we should linger while there was life in us. The air was thick and heavy, as it sometimes is before dawn breaks, and, another infallible sign in certain parts of Zuvendis that sunrise is at hand, hundreds of little spiders pendant on the end of long tough webs were floating about in it. These early rising creatures, or rather their webs, caught upon the horses and our own forms by scores, and as we had neither the time nor the energy to brush them off, we rushed along covered with hundreds of long grey threads that streamed out a yard or more behind us, and a very strange appearance they must have given us. And now before us are the huge brazen gates of the outer wall of the frowning city, and a new and horrible doubt strikes me. What if they will not let us in? "Open! Open!" I shout imperiously, at the same time giving the royal password. "Open! Open! A messenger! A messenger with tidings of the war!" "What news?" cried the guard. "And who art thou that ridest so madly? And who is that whose tongue lolls out?" And it actually did. "And who runs by thee like a dog by a chariot?" "It is the Lord Macumazahn, and with him is his dog, his black dog. Open! Open! I bring tidings." The great gates ran back on their rollers, and the drawbridge fell with a rattling crash, and we dashed on through the one and over the other. "What news, my lord? What news?" cried the guard. "Incubu rolls Sorais back as the wind a cloud," I answered, and was gone. One more effort, gallant horse, and yet more gallant man. So fall not now, Daylight, and hold thy life in thee for 15 short minutes more, O Zulu war dog, and ye shall both live for ever in the annals of the land. On, clattering through the sleeping streets. We are passing the Flower Temple now. 1 mile more. Only 1 little mile. Hold on. Keep your life in thee. See the houses run past of themselves. Up, good horse, up! There, but 50 yards now. Ah, you see your stables, and stagger on gallantly. Thank God, the palace at last! And see, the first arrows of the dawn are striking on the temple's golden dome. End note. Of course, the roof of the temple, being so high, caught the light some time before the breaking of the dawn. Allan Quatermain. But shall I get in here, or is the deed done, and the way barred. Once more I give the password and shout, "Open! Open!" No answer, and my heart grows very faint. Again I call, and this time a single voice replies, and to my joy I recognize it as belonging to Kara, a fellow officer of Nyleptha's guards, a man I know to be as honest as the light. Indeed, the same whom Nyleptha had sent to arrest Sorais on the day she fled to the temple. "Is it thou, Kara?" I cry. "I am Macumazahn. Bid the guard let down the bridge and throw wide the gate. Quick! Quick!" Then followed a space that seemed to me endless, but at length the bridge fell, and one half of the gate opened, and we got into the courtyard, where at last poor daylight fell down beneath me, as I thought, dead. Except Kara, there was nobody to be seen, and his look was wild, and his garments were all torn. He had opened the gate and let down the bridge alone, and was now getting them up and shut again, as, owing to a very ingenious arrangement of cranks and levers, one man could easily do, and indeed generally did so. "Where are the guard?" I gasped, fearing his answer as I never feared anything before. "I know not," he answered. "2 hours ago, as I slept, was I seized and bound by the watch under me, and but now, this very moment, have I freed myself with my teeth. I greatly fear, that we are betrayed." His words gave me fresh energy. Catching him by the arm, I staggered, followed by Umslopogaas, who reeled after us like a drunken man, through the courtyards, up the great hall, which was silent as the grave, towards the Queen's sleeping place. We reached the first ante-room, no guards. The second, still no guards. Oh, surely the thing was done. We were too late after all, too late. The silence and solitude of those great chambers was dreadful, and weighed me down like an evil dream. On, right into Nyleptha's chamber we rushed, and staggered, sick at heart, fearing the very worst. We saw there was a light in it, ay, and a figure bearing the light. Oh, thank God, it is the White Queen herself, the Queen unharmed. There she stands in her night gear, roused by the clatter of our coming from her bed, the heaviness of sleep yet in her eyes, and a red blush of fear and shame mantling her lovely breast and cheek. "What is it?" she cries. "What means this? O Macumazahn, is it thou? Why lookest thou so wildly? Thou comest as one bearing evil tidings. And my lord, oh, tell me not my lord is dead, not dead," she wailed, wringing her white hands. "I left Incubu wounded, but leading the advance against Sorais last night at sundown. Therefore let thy heart have rest. Sorais is beaten back all along her lines, and thy arms prevail." "I knew it," she cried in triumph. "I knew that he would win. And they called him Outlander, and shook their wise heads when I gave him the command. Last night at sundown, sayest thou, and it is not yet dawn. Surely—" "Throw a cloak around thee, Nyleptha," I broke in, "and give us wine to drink. Ay, and call thy maidens quick if thou wouldst save thyself alive. Nay, stay not." Thus adjured, she ran and called through the curtains towards some room beyond, and then hastily put on her sandals and a thick cloak, by which time a dozen or so half-dressed women were pouring into the room. "Follow us and be silent," I said to them as they gazed with wondering eyes, clinging one to another. So we went into the first ante-room. "Now," I said, "give us wine to drink and food if ye have it, for we are near to death." The room was used as a mess room for the officers of the guards, and from a cupboard some flagons of wine and some cold flesh were brought forth, and Umslopogaas and I drank, and felt life flow back into our veins as the good red wine went down. "Hark to me, Nyleptha," I said, as I put down the empty tankard. "Hast thou here among these thy waiting ladies any two of discretion?" "Ay," she said, "surely." "Then bid them go out by the side entrance to any citizens whom thou canst bethink thee of as men loyal to thee, and pray them come armed, with all honest folk that they can gather, to rescue thee from death. Nay, question not. Do as I say, and quickly. Kara here will let out the maids." She turned, and selecting two of the crowd of damsels, repeated the words I had uttered, giving them besides a list of the names of the men to whom each should run. "Go swiftly and secretly, go for your very lives," I added. In another moment they had left with Kara, whom I told to rejoin us at the door leading from the great courtyard on to the stairway as soon as he had made fast behind the girls. Thither, too, Umslopogaas and I made our way, followed by the Queen and her women. As we went we tore off mouthfuls of food, and between them I told her what I knew of the danger which encompassed her, and how we found Kara, and how all the guards and men servants were gone, and she was alone with her women in that great place. And she told me, too, that a rumour had spread through the town that our army had been utterly destroyed, and that Sorais was marching in triumph on Milosis, and how in consequence thereof all men had fallen away from her. Though all this takes some time to tell, we had not been but 6 or 7 minutes in the palace, and notwithstanding that the golden roof of the temple, being very lofty, was ablaze with the rays of the rising sun, it was not yet dawn, nor would be for another 10 minutes. We were in the courtyard now, and here my wound pained me so that I had to take Nyleptha's arm, while Umslopogaas rolled along after us, eating as he went. Now we were across it, and had reached the narrow doorway through the palace wall that opened onto the mighty stair. I looked through and stood aghast, as well I might. The door was gone, and so were the outer gates of bronze, entirely gone. They had been taken from their hinges, and as we afterwards found, hurled from the stairway to the ground 200 feet beneath. There in front of us was the semicircular standing space, about twice the size of a large oval dining table, and the 10 curved black marble steps leading on to the main stair. And that was all. End of chapter 21.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Allan Quatermain by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 22. How Umslopogaas held the stair. We looked at one another. "Thou seest," I said, "they have taken away the door. Is there aught with which we may fill the place? Speak quickly, for they will be on us ere the daylight." I spoke thus because I knew that we must hold this place or none, as there were no inner doors in the palace, the rooms being separated from one another by curtains. I also knew that if we could by any means defend this doorway, the murderers could get in nowhere else, for the palace is absolutely impregnable, that is, since the secret door by which Sorais had entered on that memorable night of attempted murder had, by Nyleptha's order, been closed up with masonry. "I have it," said Nyleptha, who, as usual with her, rose to the emergency in a wonderful way. "On the farther side of the courtyard are blocks of cut marble. The workmen brought them here for the bed of the new statue of Incubu, my lord. Let us block the door with them." I jumped at the idea, and having dispatched one of the remaining maidens down the great stair to see if she could obtain assistance from the docks below, where her father, who was a great merchant employing many men, had his dwelling place, and set another to watch through the doorway, we made our way back across the courtyard to where the hewn marble lay, and here we met Kara returning from dispatching the first two messengers. There were the marble blocks, sure enough, broad, massive lumps, some 6 inches thick and weighing about 80 pounds each, and there too were a couple of implements like small stretchers that the workmen used to carry them on. Without delay we got some of the blocks on to the stretchers, and four of the girls carried them to the doorway. "Listen, Macumazahn," said Umslopogaas. "If those low fellows come, it is I who will hold the stair against them till the door is built up. Nay, nay, it will be a man's death. Gainsay me not, old friend. It has been a good day, let it now be a good night. See, I throw myself down to rest on the marble there. When their footsteps are nigh, wake thou me, not before, for I need my strength." And without a word he went outside and flung himself down on the marble, and was instantly asleep. At this time I too was overcome, and was forced to sit down by the doorway and content myself with directing operations. The girls brought the block, while Kara and Nyleptha built them up across the 6 foot wide doorway, a triple row of them, for less would be useless. But the marble had to be brought 40 yards, and then there were 40 yards to run back, and though the girls laboured gloriously, even staggering along alone, each with a block in her arms, it was slow work, dreadfully slow. The light was growing now, and presently in the silence we heard a commotion at the far bottom of the stair, and the faint clinking of armed men. As yet the wall was only 2 feet high, and we had been 8 minutes at the building of it. So they had come. Alphonse had heard aright. The clanking sound came nearer, and in the ghostly grey of the dawning we could make out long files of men, some 50 or so in all, slowly creeping up the stair. They were now at the halfway standing place that rested on the great flying arch, and here, perceiving that something was going on above, they, to our great gain, halted for 3 or 4 minutes and consulted, then slowly and cautiously advanced again. We had been nearly a quarter of an hour at the work now, and it was almost 3 feet high. Then I woke Umslopogaas. The great man rose, stretched himself, and swung Inkosi-kaas round his head. "It is well," he said. "I feel as a young man once more. My strength has come back to me, ay, even as a lamp flares up before it dies. Fear not, I shall fight a good fight. The wine and the sleep have put a new heart into me. Macumazahn, I have dreamed a dream, I dreamed that thou and I stood together on a star, and looked down on the world, and thou wast as a spirit, Macumazahn, for light flamed through thy flesh, but I could not see what was the fashion of mine own face. The hour has come for us, old hunter. So be it. We have had our time, but I would that in it I had seen some more such fights as yesterday's. Let them bury me after the fashion of my people, Macumazahn, and set my eyes towards Zululand." And he took my hand and shook it, and then turned to face the advancing foe. Just then, to my astonishment, the Zu-Vendi officer Kara climbed over our improvised wall in his quiet, determined sort of way, and took his stand by the Zulu, unsheathing his sword as he did so. "What, comest thou too?" laughed out the old warrior. "Welcome, a welcome to thee, brave heart. Ow for the man who can die like a man! Ow for the death grip and the ringing of steel! Ow, we are ready. We whet our beaks like eagles. Our spears flash in the sun. We shake our assegais and are hungry to fight. Who comes to give greeting to the chieftainess Inkosi-kaas? Who would taste her kiss whereof the fruit is death? I, the woodpecker, I, the slaughterer, I, the swift-footed, I, Umslopogaas, of the tribe of the Maquilisini, of the people of Amazulu, a captain of the regiment of the Nkomi-Bakosi. I, Umslopogaas, the son of Indaba-zimbi, the son of Arpi, the son of Mosilikatsi, I of the royal blood of T'Chaka, I of the king's house, I the ringed man, I the Induna. I call to them as a buck calls. I challenge them. I await them. Ah, it is thou! It is thou!" As he spake, or rather chanted, his wild war song, the armed men, among whom in the growing light I recognized both Nasta and Agon, came streaming up the stair with a rush, and one big fellow, armed with a heavy spear, dashed up the 10 semicircular steps ahead of his comrades, and struck at the great Zulu with the spear. Umslopogaas moved his body but not his legs, so that the blow missed him, and next instant Inkosi-kaas crashed through the headpiece, hair and skull, and the man's corpse was rattling down the steps. As he dropped, his round hippopotamus hide shield fell from his hand onto the marble, and the Zulu stooped down and seized it, still chanting as he did so. In another second the sturdy Kara had also slain a man, and then began a scene the like of which has not been known to me. Up rushed the assailants, 1, 2, 3 at a time, and as fast as they came the axe crashed and the swords swung, and down they rolled again, dead or dying. And ever as the fight thickened the old Zulu's eye seemed to get quicker and his arm stronger. He shouted out his war cries and the names of chiefs whom he had slain, and the blows of his awful axe rained straight and true, shearing through everything they fell on. There was none of the scientific method he was so fond of about this last immortal fight of his. He had no time for it, but struck with his full strength, and at every stroke a man sank in his tracks and went rattling down the marble steps. They hacked and hewed at him with swords and spears, wounding him in a dozen places till he streamed red with blood. But the shield protected his head and the chain shirt his vitals, and for minute after minute, aided by the gallant Zu-Vendi, he still held the stair. At last Kara's sword broke, and he grappled with the foe, and they rolled down together, and he was cut to pieces, dying like the brave man that he was. Umslopogaas was alone now, but he never blenched or turned. Shouting out some wild Zulu battle cry, he beat down a foe, ay, and another, and another, till at last they drew back from the slippery blood-stained steps and stared at him with amazement, thinking that he was no mortal man. The wall of marble block was 4 feet 6 high now, and hope rose in my teeth as I leaned there against it, a miserable helpless log, and ground my teeth and watched that glorious struggle. I could do no more, for I had lost my revolver in the battle. And old Umslopogaas, he leaned too on his good axe, and faint as he was with wounds he mocked them. He called them women. The grand old warrior standing there one against so many, and for a breathing space none would come against him, notwithstanding Nasta's exhortations, till at last old Agon, who, to do him justice, was a brave man, mad with baffled rage, and seeing that the wall would soon be built and his plans defeated, shook the great spear he held and rushed up the dripping steps. "Ah, ah!" shouted the Zulu, as he recognized the priest's flowing white beard. "It is thou, old witch-finder! Come on! I await thee, white medicine man! Come on! Come on! I have sworn to slay thee, and I ever keep my faith." On he came, taking him at his word, and drave the big spear with such force at Umslopogaas that it sunk right through the tough shield and pierced him in the neck. The Zulu cast down the transfixed shield, and that moment was Agon's last, for before he could free his spear and strike again, with a shout of "There's for thee, Rainmaker!" Umslopogaas gripped Inkosi Kaas with both hands and whirled on high and drave her right onto his venerable head, so that Agon rolled down dead among the corpses of his fellow murderers, and there was an end to him and his plots altogether. And even as he fell a great cry rose from the foot of the stair, and looking out through the portion of the doorway that was yet unclosed, we saw armed men rushing up to the rescue, and called an answer to their shouts. Then the would-be murderers who yet remained on the stairway, and amongst whom I saw several priests, turned to fly, but having nowhere to go, were butchered as they fled. Only one man stayed, and he was the great Lord Nasta, Nyleptha's suitor and the father of the plot. For a moment the black-bearded Nasta stood with bowed face, leaning on his long sword as though in despair, and then with a dreadful shout he too rushed up at the Zulu, and swinging the glittering sword around his head, dealt him such a mighty blow beneath his guard that the keen steel of the heavy blade bit right through the chain armour and deep into Umslopogaas's side, for a moment paralysing him and causing him to drop his axe. Raising the sword again, Nasta sprang forward to make an end of him, but little he knew of his foe. With a shake and a yell of fury the Zulu gathered himself together and sprang straight at Nasta's throat, as I have sometimes seen a wounded lion spring. He struck him full as his foot was on the topmost stair, and his long arms closing round him like iron bands, down they rolled together, struggling furiously. Nasta was a strong man and a desperate, but he could not match the strongest man in Zululand, sore wounded though he was, whose strength was as the strength of a bull. In a minute the end came. I saw old Umslopogaas stagger to his feet. Ay, and saw him by a single gigantic effort swing up the struggling Nasta, and with a shout of triumph hurl him straight over the parapet of the bridge, to be crushed to powder on the rocks 200 feet below. The succour which had been summoned by the girl who had passed down the stair before the assassins passed up was at hand, and the loud shouts which reached us from the outer gates told us that the town was also aroused, and the men awakened by the women were calling to be admitted. Some of Nyleptha's brave ladies, who in their night shifts, and with their long hair streaming down their backs just as they had been aroused from rest, went off to admit them at the side entrance, whilst others, assisted by the rescuing party outside, pushed and pulled down the marble blocks they had placed there with so much labour. Soon the wall was down again, and through the doorway, followed by a crowd of rescuers, staggered old Umslopogaas, an awful and in a way a glorious figure. The man was a mass of wounds, and a glance at his wild eye told me that he was dying. The keshla gum ring over his head was severed in two places by sword cuts, one just over the curious hole in his skull, and the blood poured down his face from the gashes. Also on the right side of his neck was a stab from a spear inflicted by Agon. There was a deep cut on his left arm just below where the male shirt sleeve stopped, and on the right side of his body the armour was severed by a gash 6 inches long, where Nasta's mighty sword had bitten through it and deep into the wearer's vitals. On, axe in hand, he staggered, that dreadful-looking, splendid savage, and the ladies forgot to turn faint at the scene of blood, and cheered him as well they might. But he never stayed or heeded. With outstretched arms and tottering gait he pursued his way, followed by us all along the broad, shell-strewn walk that ran through the courtyard, past the spot where the blocks of marble lay, through the round arched doorway and the thick curtains that hung within it, down the short passage and into the great hall, which was now filling with hastily armed men who poured through the side entrance. Straight up the hall he went, leaving behind him a track of blood on the marble pavement, till at last he reached the sacred stone, which stood in the centre of it, and here his strength seemed to fail him, for he stopped and leaned upon his axe. Then suddenly he lifted up his voice and cried aloud, "I die! I die! But it was a kingly fray. Where are they who came up the great stair? I see them not. Art thou there, Macumazahn? Or art thou gone before to wait for me in the dark whither I go? The blood blinds me. The place turns round. I hear the voice of waters." Next, as though a new thought had struck him, he lifted the red axe and kissed the blade. "Farewell, Inkosi-kaas," he cried. "Nay, nay, we will go together. We cannot part, thou and I. We have lived too long with one another, thou and I. One more stroke, only one, a good stroke, a straight stroke, a strong stroke." And drawing himself to his full height, with a wild, heart-shaking shout, he with both hands began to whirl the axe round his head. till it looked like a circle of flaming steel. Then suddenly, with awful force, he brought it down straight onto the crown of the mass of sacred stone. A shower of sparks flew up, and such was the almost superhuman strength of the blow that the massive marble split with a rending sound into a score of pieces, whilst of Inkosi kaas there remained but some fragments of steel and a fibrous rope of shattered horn that had been the handle. Down with a crash onto the pavement fell the fragments of the holy stone, and down with a crash onto them, still grasping the knob of Inkosi kaas, fell the brave old Zulu, dead. And thus the hero died. A gasp of wonder and astonishment rose from all those who witnessed the extraordinary sight, and then somebody cried, "The prophecy! The prophecy! He has shattered the sacred stone!" And at once a murmuring arose. "Ay," said Nyleptha, with that quick wit which distinguishes her, "ay, my people, he has shattered the stone, and behold the prophecy is fulfilled. For a stranger king rules in Zu Vendis. Incubu, my lord, hath beat Sorais back, and I fear her no more, and to him who hath saved the crown it shall surely be. And this man," she said, turning to me and laying her hand upon my shoulder, "wot ye that, though wounded in the fight of yesterday, he rode with that old warrior who lies there 100 miles twixt sunset and rise to save me from the plots of cruel men? Ay, and he has saved me by a very little, and therefore because of the deeds that they have done, deeds of glory such as our history cannot show the like, therefore I say that the name of Macumazahn and the name of dead Umslopogaas, ay, and the name of Kara, my servant, who aided him to hold the stair, shall be blazoned in letters of gold above my throne, and shall be glorious for ever while the land endures. I, the Queen, have said it." This spirited speech was met with loud cheering, and I said that after all we had only done our duty, as it is the fashion of both Englishmen and Zulus to do, and there was nothing to make an outcry about, at which they cheered still more, and then I was supported across the outer courtyard to my old quarters in order that I might be put to bed. As I went, my eyes lit upon the brave horse Daylight that lay there, his white head outstretched on the pavement, exactly as he had fallen on entering the yard, and I bade those who supported me take me near him, that I might look on the good beast once more before he was dragged away. And as I looked, to my astonishment he opened his eyes, and lifting his head a little, whinnied faintly. I could have shouted for joy to find that he was not dead, only unfortunately I had not a shout left in me. But as it was, grooms were sent for, and he was lifted up, and wine poured down his throat, and in a fortnight he was as well and strong as ever, and is the pride and joy of all the people of Milosis, who, whenever they see him, point him out to the little children as the horse which saved the White Queen's life. Then I went on and got off to bed, and was washed and had my mail shirt removed. They hurt me a great deal in getting it off, and no wonder, for on my left breast and side was a black bruise the size of a saucer. The next thing that I remember was the tramp of horsemen outside the palace wall some 10 hours later. I raised myself and asked what was the news, and they told me that a large body of cavalry sent by Curtis to assist the Queen had arrived from the scene of the battle, which they had left 2 hours after sundown. When they left, the wreck of Sorais' army was in full retreat upon M'Arstuna, followed by all our effective cavalry. Sir Henry was encamping the remains of his worn-out forces on the site, such is the fortune of war, that Sorais had occupied the night before, and proposed marching to M'Arstuna on the morrow. Having heard this, I felt that I could die with a light heart, and then everything became a blank. When next I awoke, the first thing I saw was the round disc of a sympathetic eyeglass, behind which was Good. "How are you getting on, old chap?" said a voice from the neighbourhood of the eyeglass. "What are you doing here?" I asked faintly. "You ought to be at M'Arstuna. Have you run away, or what?" "M'Arstuna," he replied cheerfully. "Ah, M'Arstuna fell last week. You've been unconscious for a fortnight, you see. With all the honours of war, you know. Trumpets blowing, flags flying, just as though they had had the best of it. But for all that, weren't they glad to go? Israel made for his tents, I can tell you. Never saw such a sight in my life." "And Sorais?" I asked. "Sorais? Oh, Sorais is a prisoner. They gave her up, the scoundrels," he added with a change of tone. "Sacrificed the Queen to save their skins, you see. She's being brought up here, and I don't know what will happen to her, poor soul," and he sighed. "Where's Curtis?" I asked. "He's with Nyleptha. She rode out to meet us today, and there was a grand to-do, I can tell you. He's coming to see you tomorrow. The doctors, for there is a medical faculty in Zu Vendis as elsewhere, thought that he had better not come today." I said nothing, but somehow I thought to myself that notwithstanding the doctors he might have given me a look. But there, when a man is newly married and has just gained a great victory, he is apt to listen to the advice of doctors, and quite right too. Just then I heard a familiar voice informing me that Monsieur must now couch himself, and looking up perceived Alphonse's enormous black mustachios curling away in the distance. "So you are here," I said. "Mais oui, monsieur. The war is now finished, my military instincts are satisfied, and I return to nurse monsieur." I laughed, or rather tried to, but whatever may have been Alphonse's failings as a warrior, and I fear he did not come up to the level of his heroic grandfather in this particular, showing thereby how true is the saying that it is a bad thing to be overshadowed by some great ancestral name, a better or kinder nurse never lived. Poor Alphonse! I hope he will always think of me as kindly as I think of him. On the morrow I saw Curtis and Nyleptha with him, and he told me the whole history of what had happened since Umslopogaas and I galloped wildly away from the battle to save the life of the Queen. It seemed to me that he had managed the thing exceedingly well, and showed great ability as a general. Of course, however, our loss had been dreadfully heavy. Indeed, I am afraid to say how many perished in the desperate battle I have described, but I know that the slaughter has appreciably affected the male population of the country. He was very pleased to see me, dear fellow that he is, and thanked me with tears in his eyes for the little that I had been able to do. I saw him, however, start violently when his eyes fell upon my face. As for Nyleptha, she was positively radiant now that her dear lord had come back with no other injury than an ugly scar on his forehead. I do not believe that she allowed all the fearful slaughter that had taken place to weigh ever so little in the balance against this one fact, or even to diminish her joy, and I cannot blame her for it, seeing that it is in the nature of loving woman to look at all the things through the spectacles of her love, and little does she reck of the misery of the many if the happiness of the one be assured. That is human nature, which the positivists tell us is just perfection, so no doubt it is all right. "And what art thou going to do with Sorais?" I asked her. Instantly her bright brow darkened to a frown. "Sorais!" she said with a little stamp of the foot. "Ah, but Sorais!" Sir Henry hastened to turn the subject. "You will soon be about and all right again now, old fellow," he said. I shook my head and laughed. "Don't deceive yourselves," I said. "I may be about for a little, but I shall never be all right again. I am a dying man, Curtis. I may die slow, but die I must. Do you know I have been spitting blood all the morning? I tell you there is something working away into my lung. I can feel it. There, don't look distressed. I have had my day, and am ready to go. Give me the mirror, will you? I want to look at myself." He made some excuse, but I saw through it and insisted, and at last he handed me one of the discs of polished silver set in a wooden frame like a hand screen, which serve as looking glasses in Zu Vendis. I looked and put it down. "Ah," I said quietly, "I thought so. And you talk of my getting all right." I did not like to let them see how shocked I really was at my own appearance. My grizzled, stubby hair was turned snow white, and my yellow face was shrunk like an aged woman's, and had two deep purple rings painted beneath the eyes. Here Nyleptha began to cry, and Sir Henry again turned the subject, telling me that the artists had taken a cast of the dead body of old Umslopogaas, and that a great statue in black marble was to be erected of him in the act of splitting the sacred stone, which was to be matched by another statue in white marble of myself and the horse Daylight as he appeared when, at the termination of that wild ride, he sank beneath me in the courtyard of the palace. I have since seen these statues, which at the time of writing this, 6 months after the battle, are nearly finished, and very beautiful they are, especially that of Umslopogaas, which is exactly like him. As for that of myself, it is good that they have idealized my ugly face a little, which is perhaps as well, seeing that thousands of people will probably look at it in the centuries to come, and it is not pleasant to look at ugly things. Then they told me that Umslopogaas's last wish had been carried out, and that instead of being cremated, as I shall be, after the usual custom here, he had been tied up Zulu fashion, with his knees beneath his chin, and having been wrapped in a thin sheet of beaten gold, entombed in a hole hollowed out of the masonry of the semicircular space at the top of the stair he defended so splendidly, which faces, as far as we can judge, almost exactly towards Zululand. There he sits, and will sit forever, for they embalmed him with spices, and put him in an airtight stone coffer, keeping his grim watch beneath the spot he held alone against a multitude. And the people say that at night his ghost rises and stands shaking the phantom of Inkosi-kaas at phantom foes. Certainly they fear during the dark hours to pass the place where the hero is buried. Oddly enough, 2. A new legend or prophecy has arisen in the land, in that unaccountable way in which such things do arise among barbarous and semi-civilized people, blowing like the wind no man knows whence. According to this saying, so long as the old Zulu sits there, looking down the stairway he defended when alive, so long will the new house of the stairway, springing from the union of the Englishman and Nyleptha, endure and flourish. But when he is taken from thence, or when, ages after, his bones at last crumble into dust, the house will fall, and the stairway shall fall, and the nation of the Zu-Vendi shall cease to be a nation. End of chapter 22. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Allan Quatermain by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 23. I have spoken. It was a week after Nyleptha's visit, when I had begun to get about a little in the middle of the day, that a message came to me from Sir Henry to say that Sorais would be brought before them in the Queen's first antechamber at midday, and requesting my attendance if possible. Accordingly, greatly drawn by curiosity to see this unhappy woman once more, I made shift, with the help of that kind little fellow Alphonse, who is a perfect treasure to me, and that of another waiting man, to reach the antechamber. I got there, indeed, before anybody else, except a few of the great court officials who had been bidden to be present, but I had scarcely seated myself before Sorais was brought in by a party of guards, looking as beautiful and defiant as ever, but with a worn expression on her proud face. She was, as usual, dressed in her royal coif, emblazoned with the emblem of the sun, and in her right hand she still held a toy spear of silver. A pang of admiration and pity went through me as I looked at her, and struggling to my feet I bowed deeply, at the same time expressing my sorrow that I was not able, owing to my condition, to remain standing before her. She coloured a little, and then laughed bitterly. "Thou dost forget, Macumazahn," she said. "I am no more a queen, save in blood. I am an outcast and a prisoner, whom all men should scorn and none show deference to." "At least," I replied, "thou art still a lady, and therefore one to whom deference is due. Also thou art in an evil case, and therefore it is doubly due." "Ah," she answered with a little laugh, "thou dost forget that I would have wrapped thee in a sheet of gold and hung thee to the angel's trumpet at the topmost pinnacle of the temple." "No," I answered, "I assure thee that I forgot it not. Indeed, I often thought of it when it seemed to me that the battle of the past was turning against us, but the trumpet is there, and I am still here, though perchance not for long. So why talk of it now?" "Ah," she went on, "the battle! The battle! Oh, would that I were once more a queen, if only for one little hour, and I would take such vengeance on those accursed jackals who deserted me in my need, that it should only be spoken of in whispers. Those women, those pigeon-hearted half-breeds who suffered themselves to be overcome," and she choked in her wrath. "Ay, and that little coward beside thee," she went on, pointing at Alphonse with the silver spear, whereat he looked very uncomfortable. "He escaped and betrayed my plans. I tried to make a general of him, telling the soldiers it was Bougwan, and to scourge valour into him." Here Alphonse shivered at some unhappy recollection. "But it was of no avail. He hid beneath a banner in my tent, and thus overheard my plans. I would that I had slain him, but alas, I held my hand. And thou, Macumazahn, I have heard of what thou didst. Thou art brave, and hast a loyal heart, and the black one too, ah, he was a man. I would fain have seen him hurl Nasta from the stairway." "Thou art a strange woman, Sorais," I said. "I pray thee now plead with the Queen Nyleptha, that perchance she may show mercy unto thee." She laughed out loud. "I plead for mercy?" she said, and at that moment the Queen entered, accompanied by Sir Henry and Good, and took her seat with an impassive face. As for poor Good, he looked intensely ill at ease. "Greetings, Sorais," said Nyleptha, after a short pause. "Thou hast rent the kingdom like a rag. Thou hast put thousands of my people to the sword. Thou hast twice basely plotted to destroy my life by murder. Thou hast sworn to slay my lord and his companions, and to hurl me from the stairway. What hast thou to say why thou shouldest not die? Speak, O Sorais." "Methinks, my sister, the Queen hath forgotten the chief count of the indictment," answered Sorais in her slow musical tones. "It runs thus: thou didst strive to win the love of my lord Incubu. It is for this crime that my sister will slay me, not because I levied war. It is perchance happy for thee, Nyleptha, that I fixed my mind upon his love too late. Listen," she went on, raising her voice. "I have naught to say, save that I would I had won instead of lost. Do thou with me even as thou wilt, O Queen, and let my lord the king there," pointing to Sir Henry, "for now he will be king, carry out the sentence, as it is meet he should. For as he is the beginning of the evil, let him also be the end." And she drew herself up and shot one angry glance at him from her deep fringed eyes, and then began to toy with her spear. Sir Henry bent towards Nyleptha and whispered something that I could not catch, and then the Queen spoke. "Sorais, ever have I been a good sister to thee. When our father died, and there was much talk in the land as to whether thou shouldst sit upon the throne with me, I being the elder, I gave my voice for thee, and said, 'Nay, let her sit, she is twin with me, we were born at a birth, wherefore should the one be preferred before the other?' And so has it ever been 'twixt thee and me, my sister. But now thou knowest in what sort thou hast repaid me, but I have prevailed, and thy life is forfeit, Sorais. And yet thou art my sister, born at a birth with me, and we played together when we were little, and loved each other much, and at night we slept in the same cot, with our arms each around the other's neck, and therefore even now does my heart go out to thee, Sorais. But not for that would I spare thy life, for thy offence has been too heavy, it doth drag down the wide wings of my mercy even to the ground. Also, while thou dost live the land will never be at peace. Yet shalt thou not die, Sorais, because my dear lord here hath begged thy life of me as a boon. Therefore as a boon and as a marriage gift give I it to him, to do with even as he wills, knowing that though thou dost love him, he loves thee not, Sorais, for all thy beauty. Nay, though thou art lovely as the night in all her stars, O Lady of the Night, yet it is me his wife whom he loves, and not thee, and therefore do I give thy life to him." Sorais flushed up to her eyes and said nothing, and I do not think that I ever saw a man look more miserable than did Sir Henry at that moment. Somehow Nyleptha's way of putting the thing, though true and forcible enough, was not altogether pleasant. "I understand," stammered Curtis, looking at Good. "I understand that he were attached, attached to the Queen Sorais. I am not aware what in short, the state of your feelings may be just now, but if they happen to be that way inclined, it has struck me that, in short, it might put a satisfactory end to an unpleasant business. The lady also has ample private estates, where I am sure she would be at liberty to live unmolested as far as we are concerned. Eh, Nyleptha? Of course I only suggest." "So far as I am concerned," said Good, colouring up, "I am quite willing to forget the past, and if the Lady of the Night thinks me worth the taking, I will marry her tomorrow, or when she likes, and try to make her a good husband." All eyes were now turned to Sorais, who stood with that same slow smile upon her beautiful face which I had noticed the first time that I ever saw her. She paused a little while, and cleared her throat, and then thrice she curtsied low, once to Nyleptha, once to Curtis, and once to Good, and began to speak in measured tones. "I thank thee, most gracious Queen and royal sister, for the loving kindness thou hast shown me from my youth up, and especially in that thou hast been pleased to give my person and my fate as a gift to the Lord Incubu, the king that is to be. May prosperity, peace, and plenty deck the life path of one so merciful and so tender, even as flowers do. Long mayest thou reign, O great and glorious Queen, and hold thy husband's love in both thy hands, and many be the sons and daughters of thy beauty. And I thank thee, my Lord Incubu, the king that is to be. I thank thee 1,000 times, in that thou hast been pleased to accept that gracious gift and to pass it on to thy comrade in arms and in adventure, the Lord Bougwan. Surely the act is worthy of thy greatness, my Lord Incubu. And now lastly, I thank thee also, my Lord Bougwan, who in thy turn hast deigned to accept me and my poor beauty. I thank thee 1,000 times, and I will add that thou art a good and honest man, and I put my hand upon my heart and swear that I would that I could say thee yea. And now that I have rendered thanks to all in turn," and again she smiled, "I will add one short word. Little can you understand of me, Queen Nyleptha, and my lords, if ye know not that for me there is no middle path, that I scorn your pity and hate you for it, that I cast off your forgiveness as though it were a serpent's sting, and that standing here, betrayed, deserted, insulted, and alone, I yet triumph over you, mock you, and defy you, one and all. And thus I answer you," and then of a sudden, before anybody guessed what she intended to do, she drove the little silver spear she carried in her hand into her side, with such a strong and steady aim that the keen point projected through her back, and she fell prone upon the pavement. Nyleptha shrieked, and poor Good almost fainted at the sight, while the rest of us rushed towards her. But Sorais of the Night lifted herself upon her hand, and for a moment fixed her glorious eyes intently on Curtis's face, as though there were some message in the glance, then dropped her head and sighed, and with a sob her dark but splendid spirit passed. Well, they gave her a royal funeral, and there was an end of her. It was a month after the last act of the Sorais tragedy that a great ceremony was held in the Flower Temple, and Curtis was formally declared King Consort of Zu Vendis. I was too ill to go myself, and indeed I hate all that sort of thing, with the crowds and the trumpet blowing and banner waving. But Good, who was there in his full dress uniform, came back much impressed, and told me that Nyleptha had looked lovely, and Curtis had borne himself in a right royal fashion, and had been received with acclamations that left no doubt as to his popularity. Also he told me that when the horse Daylight was led along in the procession, the populace had shouted "Macumazahn, Macumazahn," till they were hoarse, and would only be appeased when he, Good, rose in his chariot and told them that I was too ill to be present. Afterwards, too, Sir Henry, or rather the King, came to see me, looking very tired, and vowing that he had never been so bored in his life. But I dare say that that was a slight exaggeration. It is not in human nature that a man should be altogether bored on such an extraordinary occasion, and indeed, as I pointed out to him, it was a marvellous thing that a man who but little more than 1 short year before had entered a great country as an unknown wanderer, should today be married to its beautiful and beloved Queen, and lifted, amidst public rejoicings, to its throne. I even went the length to exhort him in the future not to be carried away by the pride and pomp of absolute power, but always to strive to remember that he was first a Christian gentleman and next a public servant, called by Providence to a great and almost unprecedented trust. These remarks, which he might fairly have resented, he was so good as to receive with patience, and even to thank me for making them. It was immediately after this ceremony that I caused myself to be moved to the house where I am now writing. It is a very pleasant country seat, situated about 2 miles from the frowning city, onto which it looks. That was 5 months ago, during the whole of which time I have, being confined to a kind of couch, employed my leisure in compiling this history of our wanderings from my journal and from our joint memories. It is probable that it will never be read, but it does not much matter whether it is or not. At any rate, it has served to while away many hours of suffering, for I have suffered a deal of pain lately. Thank God, however, there will not be much more of it. It is a week since I wrote the above, and now I take up my pen for the last time, for I know that the end is at hand. My brain is still clear, and I can manage to write, though with difficulty. The pain in my lung, which has been very bad during the last week, has suddenly quite left me, and been succeeded by a feeling of numbness of which I cannot mistake the meaning. And just as the pain has gone, so with it all fear of that end has departed, and I feel only as though I were going to sink into the arms of an unutterable rest. Happily, contentedly, and with the same sense of security with which an infant lays itself to sleep in its mother's arms, do I lay myself down in the arms of the angel Death. All the tremors, all the heart-shaking fears which have haunted me through a life that seems long as I look back upon it, have left me now. The storms have passed, and the star of our eternal hope shines clear and steady on the horizon that seems so far from man and yet is so very near to me tonight. And so this is the end of it, a brief space of troubling, a few restless, fevered, anguished years, and then the arms of the great angel Death. Many times have I been near to them, and now it is my turn at last, and it is well. 24 hours more and the world will be gone from me, and with it all its hopes and all its fears. The air will close in over the space that my form filled, and my place know me no more. For the dull breath of the world's forgetfulness will first dim the brightness of my memory, and then blot it out for ever, and of a truth I shall be dead. So it is with us all. How many millions have lain as I lie, and thought these thoughts, and been forgotten? Thousands upon thousands of years ago they thought them, those dying men of the dim past, and thousands on thousands of years hence will their descendants think them, and be in their turn forgotten. As the breath of the oxen in winter, as the quick star that runs along the sky, as a little shadow that loses itself at sunset, as I once heard a Zulu called Ignosi put it, such is the order of our life, the order that passeth away. Well, it is not a good world. Nobody can say that it is, save those who wilfully blind themselves to facts. How can a world be good in which money is the moving power, and self-interest the guiding star? The wonder is not that it is so bad, but that there should be any good left in it. Still, now that my life is over, I am glad to have lived, glad to have known the dear breath of woman's love, and that true friendship which can even surpass the love of woman, glad to have heard the laughter of little children, to have seen the sun and the moon and the stars, to have felt the kiss of the salt sea on my face, and watched the wild game trek down to the water in the moonlight. But I should not wish to live again. Everything is changing to me. The darkness draws near, and the light departs, and yet it seems to me that through that darkness I can already see the shining welcome of many a long-lost face. Harry is there, and others. One above all, to my mind, the sweetest and most perfect woman that ever gladdened this grey earth. But of her I have already written elsewhere, and at length, so why speak of her now? Why speak of her after this long silence, now that she is again so near to me, now that I go where she has gone? The sinking sun is turning the golden roof of the great temple to a fiery flame, and my fingers tire. So to all who have known me, or known of me, to all who can think one kindly thought of the old hunter, I stretch out my hand from the far-off shore and bid a long farewell. And now into the hands of Almighty God, who sent it, do I commit my spirit. I have spoken, as the Zulus say. End of chapter 23. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Allan Quatermain by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 24. By Another Hand. A year has elapsed since our most dear friend Allan Quatermain wrote the words "I have spoken" at the end of his record of our adventures, nor should I have ventured to make any additions to the record had it not happened that by a most strange accident a chance has arisen of its being conveyed to England. The chance is but a faint one, it is true, but as it is not probable that another will arise in our lifetimes, Good and myself think that we may as well avail ourselves of it, such as it is. During the last 6 months, several frontier commissions have been at work on the various boundaries of Zu-Vendis, with a view of discovering whether there exists any possible means of ingress or egress from the country, with the result that a channel of communication with the outer world hitherto overlooked has been discovered. This channel, apparently the only one, for I have discovered that it was by it that the native who ultimately reached Mr. Mackenzie's mission station, and whose arrival in the country, together with the fact of his expulsion, for he did arrive about 3 years before ourselves, was for reasons of their own kept a dead secret by the priests to whom he was brought, is about to be effectually closed. But before this is done, a messenger is to be dispatched, bearing with him this manuscript, and also 1 or 2 letters from Good to his friends, and from myself to my brother George, whom it deeply grieves me to think I shall never see again, informing them, as our next heirs, that they are welcome to our effects in England, if the Court of Probate will allow them to take them. End note. Of course, the Court of Probate would allow nothing of the sort. Editor. Inasmuch as we have made up our minds never to return to Europe. Indeed, it would be impossible for us to leave Zu-Vendis even if we wished to do so. The messenger who is to go, and I wish him joy of his journey, is Alphonse. For a long while he has been wearied to death of Zu-Vendis and its inhabitants. "Oh, oui, c'est beau," he says with an expressive shrug, "mais je m'ennuie, ce n'est pas chic." Again he complains dreadfully of the absence of cafes and theatres, and moans continually for his lost Annette, of whom, he says, he dreams 3 times a week. But I fancy his secret cause of disgust at the country, putting aside the homesickness to which every Frenchman is subject, is that the people here laugh at him so dreadfully about his conduct on the occasion of the great battle of the pass about 18 months ago, when he hid beneath a banner in Sorais' tent in order to avoid being sent forth to fight, which he says would have gone against his conscience. Even the little boys call out at him in the streets, thereby offending his pride and making his life unbearable. At any rate, he has determined to brave the horrors of a journey of almost unprecedented difficulty and danger, and also to run the risk of falling into the hands of the French police to answer for a certain little indiscretion of his own some years old, though I do not consider that a very serious matter, rather than remain in ce triste pays. Poor Alphonse! We shall be very sorry to part with him, but I sincerely trust, for his own sake and also for the sake of this history, which is, I think, worth giving to the world, that he may arrive in safety. If he does, and can carry the treasure we have provided him with in the shape of bars of solid gold, he will be, comparatively speaking, a rich man for life, and well able to marry his Annette, if she is still in the land of the living and willing to marry her Alphonse. Anyhow, on the chance, I may as well add a word or two to dear old Quatermain's narrative. He died at dawn on the day following that on which he wrote the last words of the last chapter. Nyleptha, Good, and myself were present, and a most touching and yet in its way beautiful scene it was. An hour before the daybreak it became apparent to us that he was sinking, and our distress was very keen. Indeed, Good melted into tears at the idea, a fact that called forth a last gentle flicker of humour from our dying friend, for even at that hour he could be humorous. Good's emotion had, by loosening the muscles, naturally caused his eyeglass to fall from its accustomed place, and Quatermain, who always observed everything, observed this also. "At last," he gasped, with an attempt at a smile, "I have seen Good without his eyeglass." After that he said no more till the day broke, when he asked to be lifted up to watch the rising of the sun for the last time. "In a very few minutes," he said, after gazing earnestly at it, "I shall have passed through those golden gates." 10 minutes afterwards he raised himself and looked us fixedly in the face. "I am going a stranger journey than any we have ever taken together. Think of me sometimes," he murmured. "God bless you all. I shall wait for you." And with a sigh he fell back dead. And so passed away a character that I consider went as near perfection as any it has ever been my lot to encounter. Tender, constant, humorous, and possessing of many of the qualities that go to make a poet, he was yet almost unrivalled as a man of action and a citizen of the world. I never knew anyone so competent to form an accurate judgment of men and their motives. "I have studied human nature all my life," he would say, "and I ought to know something about it," and he certainly did. He had but two faults. One was his excessive modesty, and the other a slight tendency which he had to be jealous of anybody on whom he concentrated his affections. As regards the first of these points, anybody who reads what he has written will be able to form his own opinion, but I will add one last instance of it. As the reader will doubtless remember, it is a favourite trick of his to talk of himself as a timid man, whereas really, though very cautious, he possessed a most intrepid spirit, and what is more, never lost his head. Well, in the great battle of the pass, where he got the wound that finally killed him, one would imagine from the account which he gives of the occurrence that it was a chance blow that fell on him in the scrimmage. As a matter of fact, however, he was wounded in a most gallant and successful attempt to save Good's life, at the risk and, as it ultimately turned out, at the cost of his own. Good was down on the ground, and one of Nasta's Highlanders was about to dispatch him, when Quatermain threw himself onto his prostrate form and received the blow on his own body, and then, rising, killed the soldier. As regards his jealousy, a single instance, which I give in justice to myself and Nyleptha, will suffice. The reader will, perhaps, recollect that in one or two places he speaks as though Nyleptha monopolized me, and he was left by both of us rather out in the cold. Now, Nyleptha is not perfect, any more than any other woman is, and she may be a little exigent at times, but as regards Quatermain the whole thing is pure imagination. Thus, when he complains about my not coming to see him when he is ill, the fact was that, in spite of my entreaties, the doctors positively forbade it. Those little remarks of his pained me very much when I read them, for I loved Quatermain as dearly as though he were my own father, and should never have dreamed of allowing my marriage to interfere with that affection. But let it pass. It is, after all, but one little weakness, which makes no great show among so many and such lovable virtues. Well, he died, and Good read the burial service over him in the presence of Nyleptha and myself, and then his remains were, in deference to the popular clamour, accorded a great public funeral, or rather cremation. I could not help thinking, however, as I marched in that long and splendid procession up to the temple, how he would have hated the whole thing could he have been there to see it, for he had a horror of ostentation. And so, a few minutes before sunset, on the third night after his death, they laid him on the brazen flooring before the altar, and waited for the last ray of the setting sun to fall upon his face. Presently it came, and struck him like a golden arrow, crowning the pale brows with glory, and then the trumpets blew and the flooring revolved, and all that remained of our beloved friend fell into the furnace below. We shall never see his like again if we live 100 years. He was the ablest man, the truest gentleman, the firmest friend, the finest sportsman, and, I believe, the best shot in all Africa. And so ended the very remarkable and adventurous life of Hunter Quatermain. Since then, things have gone very well with us. Good has been, and still is, busily employed in the construction of a navy on Lake Milosis and another of the large lakes, by means of which we hope to be able to increase trade and commerce, and also to overcome some very troublesome and warlike sections of the population who live upon their borders. Poor fellow! He is beginning to get over the sad death of that misguided but most attractive woman, Sorais, but it is a sad blow to him, for he was really deeply attached to her. I hope, however, that he will in time make a suitable marriage and get that unhappy business out of his head. Nyleptha has one or two young ladies in view, especially a daughter of Nasta's, who was a widower, a very fine imperial-looking girl, but with too much of her father's intriguing and yet haughty spirit to suit my taste. As for myself, I should scarcely know where to begin if I set to work to describe my doings, so I had best leave them undescribed, and content myself with saying that, on the whole, I am getting on very well in my curious position of king consort, better, indeed, than I had any right to expect. But of course it is not all plain sailing, and I do find the responsibilities very heavy. Still, I hope to be able to do some good in my time, and I intend to devote myself to two great ends, namely, to the consolidation of the various clans which together make up the Zu Vendi people under one strong central government, and to the sapping of the power of the priesthood. The first of these reforms will, if it can be carried out, put an end to the disastrous civil wars that have for centuries devastated this country, and the second, besides removing a source of political danger, will pave the road for the introduction of true religion in the place of this senseless sun worship. I yet hope to see the shadow of the cross of Christ lying on the golden dome of the flower temple, or if I do not, that my successors may. There is one more thing that I intend to devote myself to, and that is the total exclusion of all foreigners from Zu Vendis. Not, indeed, that any more are ever likely to get here, but if they do, I warn them fairly that they will be shown by the shortest way out of the country. I do not say this from any sense of inhospitality, but because I am convinced of the sacred duty that rests upon me of preserving to this, on the whole, upright and generous-hearted people the blessings of comparative barbarism. Where would all my brave army be if some enterprising rascal were to attack us with field guns and Martini Henrys? I cannot see that gunpowder, telegraphs, steam, daily newspapers, universal suffrage, etc., etc., have made mankind one whit the happier than they used to be, and I am certain that they have brought many evils in their train. I have no fancy for handing over this beautiful country to be torn and fought for by speculators, tourists, politicians, and teachers, whose voice is as the voice of Babel, just as those horrible creatures in the valley of the underground river tore and fought for the body of the wild swan. Nor will I endow it with the greed, drunkenness, new diseases, gunpowder, and general demoralization which chiefly mark the progress of civilization amongst unsophisticated peoples. If in due course it pleases Providence to throw Zu-Vendis open to the world, that is another matter, but of myself I will not take the responsibility, and I may add that Good entirely approves of my decision. Farewell. Henry Curtis. December 15th, 18... P.S. I quite forgot to say that about 9 months ago Nyleptha, who is very well, and in my eyes at any rate more beautiful than ever, presented me with a son and heir. He is a regular curly-haired, blue-eyed young Englishman in looks, and though he is destined, if he lives, to inherit the throne of Zu-Vendis, I hope I may be able to bring him up to become what an English gentleman should be, and generally is, which is to my mind even a prouder and a finer thing than being born heir apparent to the great house of the stairway, and indeed the highest rank that a man can reach upon this earth. H.C. Note by George Curtis, Esquire. The manuscript of this history, addressed to me in the handwriting of my dear brother Henry Curtis, whom we had given up for dead, and bearing the Aden postmark, reached me in safety on December 20th, 18, or a little more than 2 years after it left his hands in the far centre of Africa, and I hasten to give the astonishing story it contains to the world. Speaking for myself, I have read it with very mixed feelings, for though it is a great relief to know that he and Good are alive and strangely prosperous, I cannot but feel that for me and for all their friends they might as well be dead, since we can never hope to see them more. They have cut themselves off from old England and from their homes and their relations for ever, and perhaps, under the circumstances, they were right and wise to do so. How the manuscript came to be posted I have been quite unable to discover, but I presume from the fact of its being posted at all that the little Frenchman, Alphonse, accomplished his hazardous journey in safety. I have, however, advertised for him, and caused various inquiries to be made in Marseille and elsewhere with a view of discovering his whereabouts, but so far without the slightest success. Possibly he is dead, and the packet was posted by another hand, or possibly he is now happily wedded to his Annette, but still fears the vengeance of the law and prefers to remain incognito. I cannot say. I have not yet abandoned my hopes of finding him, but I am bound to say that they grow fainter day by day, and one great obstacle to my search is that nowhere in the whole history does Mr. Quatermain mention his surname. He is always spoken of as Alphonse, and there are so many Alphonses. The letters which my brother Henry says he is sending with the packet of manuscript have never arrived, so I presume that they are lost or destroyed. George Curtis. End of Allan Quatermain.